Hey everybody, Marcus here. In this video, I want to give a philosophical account of how a man going his own way comes into existence. Now, many MGTOW have shared their personal journeys into adopting this label, and though each account is unique in their details, there do seem to be consistent themes that I think it would be of value to point out. One theme that MGTOW tend to adopt in describing their experience is reflected in the movie The Matrix, and they tend to link their experience with that of Neo after choosing the red pill and awakening to some profound revelations from which there really is no coming back. The use of the Matrix as an allegory for the coming to be of a MGTOW, is fairly effective, but it does have some shortcomings. After taking the red pill, Neo is then rescued by Morpheus and handheld into coming to grips with the new reality that he finds himself in. Also, Neo is surrounded by other awakened souls. In fact, after being freed of the Matrix, he no longer interacts with anyone in the Matrix in any meaningful manner. So he only deals with awakened souls. Now, the Matrix is not really presenting an original idea. The theme actually has its roots in Plato's Republic, Book 7, Section 514a to 517a, where Socrates presents his allegory of the prisoners in the cave. Why I bring this up is because I think that the allegory of the cave very eloquently describes this matrix-like phenomenon, and also extends the allegory to more accurately describe what happens after you take the red pill. So, what I would like to do is read for you those sections of the Republic straight from the Cooper translation so you can hear in Plato's own words how he perceived this experience. Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling with an entrance a long way up which is both open to the light and as wide as the cave itself. They've been there since childhood, fixed in the same place with their necks and legs fettered, able to see only in front of them, because their bonds prevent them from turning their heads around. Light is provided by a fire burning far above and behind them. Also behind them, but on higher ground, there's a path stretching between them and the fire. Imagine that along this path, a low wall has been built, like the screen in front of puppeteers above which they show their puppets. I'm imagining it. Then also imagine that there are people along the wall carrying all kinds of artifacts that project above it. Statues of people and other animals made out of stone, out of wood, and every material. And as you'd expect, some of the carriers are talking and some are silent. Well, it's a strange image you're describing here, and strange prisoners. They're like us. Do you suppose, first of all, that these prisoners see anything of themselves and one another besides the shadows that the fire casts on the wall in front of them? Well, how could they, if they have to keep their heads motionless throughout their life? What about the things being carried along the wall? Isn't the same true of them? Well, of course. And if they could talk to one another, don't you think they'd suppose that the names they used applied to the things they see passing before? Well, they'd have to. And what if their prison also had an echo from the wall facing them? Don't you think they'd believe that the shadows passing in front of them were talking whenever one of the carriers passing along the wall was doing so? Well, I certainly do. Then the prisoners would in every way believe that the truth is nothing other than the shadows of those artifacts. Well, they must surely believe that. Consider, then, what being released from their bonds and cured of their ignorance would naturally be like, if something like this came to pass. When one of them was freed and suddenly compelled to stand up, turn his head, walk, and look up towards the light, he'd be pained and dazzled and unable to see the things whose shadows he'd seen before. What do you think he'd say if we told him that what he'd seen before was inconsequential, but that now, because he is a bit closer to the things that are, and is turned towards things that are more, he sees more correctly? Or to put it in another way, if we pointed to each of the things passing by, asked him what each of them is, and compelled him to answer, don't you think he'd be at a loss, and that he'd believe that the things he saw earlier were truer than the ones he was now being shown? Well, much truer. And if someone compelled him to look at the light itself, wouldn't his eyes hurt? And wouldn't he turn around and flee towards the things he's able to see, believing that they're really clearer than the ones he's being shown? Well, he would. And if someone dragged him away from there by force, up the rough, steep path, and didn't let him go until he had dragged him into the sunlight, wouldn't he be pained and irritated at being treated that way? And when he came into the light, with the sun filling his eyes, wouldn't he be unable to see a single one of the things now said to be true? He would be unable to see them, well, at least at first. Well, I suppose then that he'd need time to get adjusted before he could see things in the world above. At first, he'd see shadows most easily, then images of men and other things in water, then the things themselves. Of these, he'd be able to study the things in the sky, and the sky itself more easily at night, looking at the light of the stars and the moon, then during the day, looking at the sun and the light of the sun. Well, of course. So finally, I suppose, he'd be able to see the sun, not images of it in water or some alien place, but the sun itself in its own place, and be able to study it. Well, necessarily so. And at this point, he would infer and conclude that the sun provides the seasons and the years, governs everything in the visible world, and is in some way the cause of all the things that he used to see. Well, it's clear that would be his next step. What about when he reminds himself of his first dwelling place, his fellow prisoners, and what passed for wisdom there? Don't you think that he'd count himself happy for the change and pity the others? Well, certainly. And if there had been any honors, praises, or prizes amongst them for the one who was sharpest at identifying the shadows as they passed by, and who best remembered which usually came earlier, which later, and which simultaneously, and who could thus best divine the future, do you think that our man would desire these rewards or envy those amongst the prisoners who were honored and held power? Instead, wouldn't he feel, with Homer, that he'd much prefer to work the earth as a serf to another, one without possessions, and go through any sufferings, rather than share their opinions and live as they do? Well, I suppose he would rather suffer anything than live like that. Consider this, too. If this man went down into the cave again and sat down in his same seat, wouldn't his eyes, coming suddenly out of the sun like that, be filled with darkness? Well, they certainly would. And before his eyes had recovered, and the adjustment would not be quick, while his vision was still dim, if he had to compete again with the perpetual prisoners in recognizing the shadows, wouldn't he invite ridicule? Wouldn't it be said of him that he'd returned from his upward journey with his eyesight ruined, and that it isn't worthwhile even to try to travel upwards? And as for anyone who tried to free them and lead them upwards, if they could somehow get their hands on him, wouldn't they kill him? Well, they certainly would. So what did Plato just describe? The prisoners are blue pill men, there since childhood, fixed in the same place, with their necks and legs fettered, where the fetters are traditions and the commonly accepted beliefs as to the role of a man in the world. The shadows he sees are then nothing more than seeing his father play out his role, men as portrayed in the media, and his friend's validation when he espouses the same sentiments. And because all he sees are these shadows, he comes to believe that the role of a man is like those shadows and has no reason to believe otherwise. And if someone dragged him away from the cave and its shadows by force, wouldn't he be pained and irritated at being treated that way? This is the anger that typically follows taking the red pill. And some men, those who we call purple pill men, are very accurately described as the ones whose eyes have not yet adjusted. To them, marriage and relationships still seem more real than the light. The shadows are still more real to purple pill men. They seemed clearer than the new things they are being shown. Plato then writes, he would be unable to see things as they are, at least not at first. He'd need time to get adjusted before he could see things in the world above. At first, he'd see shadows most easily, then images of men and other things in water, then the things themselves. Of these, he'd be able to study things in the sky, and the sky itself more easily at night, looking at the light of the stars and moon, then, during the day, looking at the sun and the light of the sun. Finally, I suppose he'd be able to see the sun, not images of it in water or some alien space, but the sun itself, in its own place, and be able to study it. So Plato's describing what some MGTOW have now adopted as the 4 levels of MGTOW. each corresponding to the adjustment of the eyes to the light. At first, a man may shun marriage, then relationships. After that, he will begin to cease all interaction with women, and finally become completely self-sustaining. Whether or not one agrees with the content of any given level, what we encounter is the same model of adjustment Plato is describing. This is further reinforced as we explore the freed prisoner's attitude towards those still shackled in the cave. So, Plato writes, "Don't you think that he'd count himself happy for the change and pity the others? And if there had been any honors, praises, or prizes amongst them for the one who was sharpest at identifying the shadows as they passed by, and who best remembered which usually came earlier, which later, and which simultaneously, and who could thus best divine the future, do you think that our man would desire these rewards, or envy those amongst the prisoners who were honored and held power? Instead, wouldn't he feel, with Homer, that he'd much prefer to work the earth as a serf to another, one without possessions, and go through any suffering, rather than share their opinions and live as they do? I suppose he would rather suffer anything than live like that." The red pill man can no longer relate to the shadows which the blue pill man holds in esteem. Their value systems deviate. Notions like soulmates, growing old together, the white picket fence and 2.4 children are, something to be pitied. Suffering is preferable to continuing to hold such notions. Suffering is preferable to live a life akin to the blue pill man. And then finally, the blue pill man's attitude, the attitude of society towards the red pill man. Wouldn't it be said of him that he'd return from his upward journey with his eyesight ruined, and that it isn't worthwhile even to try to travel upward? And as for anyone who tried to free them and lead them upward, if they could somehow get their hands on him, wouldn't they kill him? They certainly would. And this is exactly congruent with what the red pill man experiences: shaming language, silencing tactics, censorship, violent protest, doxing. MGTOW in the eyes of the blue pill man is something that must be exterminated, not because we are wrong, not because they care for our well-being, but because we serve as exemplars that undermine their very identities. We threaten to pull out their purpose in life right from under them. Our existence serves as an exemplar that their lives are not worth living, and this pisses them off immensely. Now, the allegory of the cave, however, still leaves one question unanswered. How does a prisoner in the cave become free? What breaks those shackles so that one may begin the journey upward? To answer this question, I would like to read to you something from the introduction to Human, All Too Human by Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche begins by describing a great longing within him for equals, equals of spirit and dispositions. In the same way, MGTOW would search out and desire the company of other MGTOW, others freed from the cave. Nietzsche, too, was searching for such free spirits, such free spirits. Since we have the luxury of the internet today, we have found each other. This was not the case for Nietzsche. He could not find any such free spirits, but he did speculate as to what could possibly give birth to one. Here's his account from the English translation by Helen Zimmern and Paul Cohn. Preface Sections 3 to 8. It may be conjectured that the decisive event for a spirit in whom the type of the free spirit is one day to ripen to sweet perfection has been a great separation, and that before it he was probably all the more a bound spirit, and seemed to be chained forever to his corner, to his post. What binds most firmly? Which cords can almost not be torn? With men of a high and select type, it will be their obligations, that awe which befits the young, their diffidence and delicacy before all that is time-honored and dignified, their gratitude for the ground out of which they grew, for the hand that led them, for the shrine where they learned to worship. Their own highest moments will bind them most firmly, and oblige them most lastingly. For such bound people, the great separation comes suddenly, like the shock of an earthquake. All at once, the young soul is devastated, torn loose, torn out. It itself does not know what is happening. An urge, a pressure governs it, mastering the soul like a command. The will and wish awaken to go away, anywhere, at any cost. A violent, dangerous curiosity for an undiscovered world flames up and flickers in all the senses. Better to die than live here, so sounds the imperious and seductive voice. And this here, this at home, is everywhere which it had loved until then. A sudden horror and suspicion of that which it loved, a lightning flash of contempt towards that which was its obligation, a rebellious, despotic, volcanic, jolting desire to roam abroad, to become alienated, cool, sober, icy, a hatred of love, perhaps a desecratory reaching and glancing backward to where it had until then worshipped and loved, perhaps a blush of shame at its most recent act, and at the same time jubilation that it was done, a drunken inner jubilant shudder which betrays a victory. A victory? Over what? Over whom? A puzzling, questioning, questionable victory, but the first victory nonetheless. Such bad and painful things are part of the history of the Great Separation. It is also a disease that can destroy man, this first outburst of strength and will to self-determination, this self-valorization, this will to free will. And how much disease is expressed by the wild attempts and peculiarities with which the freed man, the separate man, now tries to prove his rule over things? He wanders about savagely, with an unsatisfied lust. His booty must atone for the dangerous tension of his pride. He rips apart what attracts him. With an evil laugh he overturns what he finds concealed, spared until then by some shame. He investigates how these things look if they are overturned. There's some arbitrariness and pleasure in arbitrariness to it. If he then perhaps directs his favor to that which previously stood in disrepute, if he creeps curiously and enticingly around what is most forbidden, behind his ranging activities, for he is journeying restlessly and aimlessly, as in a desert, stands the question mark of an ever more dangerous curiosity. Cannot all values be overturned? And is good perhaps evil? And God only an invention, a nicety of the devil? Is everything perhaps ultimately false? And if we are deceived, are we not for that very reason also deceivers? Must we not be deceivers too? Such thoughts lead and mislead him, always further onwards, always further away, longingly surrounds him, curls around him, every more threatening, strangling, heart-constricting, that fearful goddess and matis of Cupidonium. But who today knows what loneliness is? It is still a long way from this morbid isolation, from the desert of these experimental years, to that enormous, overflowing certainty and health which cannot do without even illness itself as an instrument and fishhook of knowledge, to that mature freedom of the spirit which is fully as much self-mastery and discipline of the heart, and which permits paths to make opposing ways of thought. It is a long way to the inner spaciousness and cosseting of a superabundance which precludes the danger that the spirit might lose itself on its own path and fall in love and stay put, intoxicated, in some nook. A long way to that, excess of vivid healing, reproducing, reviving powers, the very sign of great health, an excess that gives the free spirit the dangerous privilege of being permitted to live experimentally and to offer himself to adventure. The privilege of the master, free spirit. In between may lie long years of convalescence, years full of multicolored, painful, magical transformations, governed and led by a tough will to health, which already often dares to dress and disguise itself as health. There's a middle point on the way, which a man having such a fate cannot remember later without being moved. A pale, fine light and sunny happiness are characteristic of it. A feeling of a bird-like freedom, bird-like perspective, bird-like arrogance, some third thing in which curiosity and a tender contempt are united. A free spirit. This cool term is soothing in that state, almost warming. No longer chained down by hatred and love, one lives without yes, without no, voluntarily near, voluntarily far, most preferably slipping away, avoiding, fluttering on, gone again, flying upward again. One is spoiled, like anyone who has ever seen an enormous multiplicity beneath him, and one becomes the antithesis of those who trouble themselves about things that do not concern them. Indeed, now the free spirit concerns himself only with things, and how many things there are, which no longer trouble him. Another step onward in convalescence. The free spirit again approaches life, slowly, of course, almost recalcitrantly, almost suspiciously. It grows warmer around him again, yellower, as it were. Feeling and fellow feeling gain depth, mild breezes of all kinds pass over him. He almost feels as if his eyes were only now open to what is near. He is amazed and sits motionless. Where has he been, then? These near and nearest things, how they seem to him transformed. What magical fluff they have acquired in the meantime. He glances backwards gratefully, grateful to his travels, to his severity and self-alienation, to his far-off glances and bird flights into cold heights. How good that he did not stay at home, with himself, the whole time, like a dull, pampered loafer. He was beside himself. There's no doubt about that. Only now does he see himself, and what surprises he finds there. What untried terrors. What happiness even in weariness, in the old illness, in the convalescence relapses. How he likes to sit still, suffering, spinning patience, or to lie in the sun. Who understands as he does the happiness of winter, the sunspots on the wall? They are the most grateful animals in the world, the most modest too. These convalescents and squirrels turned halfway back to life again. These are those among them who let no day pass without hanging a little song of praise on his trailing hem. And to speak seriously, all pessimism, the inveterate evil of old idealists and liars, as we know, is thoroughly cured by falling ill in the way these free spirits do, staying ill for a good while, and then, for even longer, becoming healthy. I mean, healthier. There's wisdom, practical wisdom in it, when over a long period of time, even health itself is administered only in small doses. About that time, it may finally happen, among the sudden illuminations of a still turbulent, still changeable state of health, that the free spirit, ever freer, begins to unveil the mystery of that great separation, which until then had waited impenetrable, questionable, almost unapproachable in his memory. Perhaps for a long time he hardly dared ask himself, why so apart, so alone? Renouncing everything I admired, even admiration? Why this severity, this suspicion, this hatred of one's own virtues? But now he dares to ask it loudly, and already hears something like an answer. You had to become your own master, and also the master of your own virtues. Previously, your virtues were your masters, but they must be nothing more than your tools, along with other tools. You had to gain power over your for and against, and learn how to hang them out or take them in according to your highest purpose. You had to learn that all estimations had a perspective, to learn the displacement, distortion, apparently teleology of horizons, and whatever else is part of perspective. Also, the bit of stupidity in regard to opposite values, and all the intellectual damage that every for or against exacts in payment. You had to learn to grasp the necessary injustice in every for and against, to grasp that injustice is inseparable from life, that life itself is determined by perspective and its injustice. Above all, you had to see clearly wherever injustice is greatest, where life is developed least, most narrowly, meagerly, rudimentarily, and yet cannot help taking itself as the purpose and measure of things, and for the sake of its preservation, picking at and questioning secretly and pettily and incessantly what is higher, greater, and richer. You had to see clearly the problem of hierarchy and how power and justice and breadth of perspective grow upward together. You had to... enough. Now the free spirit knows which thou shalt he has obeyed, and also what he now can do, what he only now is permitted to do. That is how the free spirit answers himself about the mystery of separation, and he ends by generalizing his case to decide thus about his experience. As it happened to me, he tells himself, so must it happen to everyone in whom a task wants to take form and come into the world. The secret power and necessity of this task will hold sway within and among his various destinies like an unsuspected pregnancy, long before he has looked the task itself in the eye or knows its name. Our destiny commands us, even when we do not yet know what it is. It is the future which gives the rule to our present. Granted that it is the problem of hierarchy which we may call our problem, we free spirits. Only now, in the noonday of our lives, do we understand what preparations, detours, trials, temptations, disguises were needed before the problem was permitted to rise up before us. We understand how we first had to experience the most numerous and contradictory conditions of misery and happiness in our bodies and souls, as adventurers and circumnavigators of that inner world which is called human being, as surveyors of every higher and one above the other, which is likewise called human being, penetrating everywhere, almost without fear, scorning nothing, losing nothing, savoring everything, cleaning and virtually straining off everything of the coincidental, until we finally could say, we free spirits, here is a new problem. Here is a long ladder on whose rungs we ourselves have sat and climbed, and which we ourselves were at one time. Here is a higher, a deeper, a below us, an enormous long ordering, a hierarchy which we see. Here is our problem. Nietzsche usually uses flowery language, which at times can get in the way of extracting the meaning that he is driving towards, especially if you are not used to his style. However, we must give him some credit for attempting to verbalize what is inherently an existential experience. The writing itself tells the story of an inner journey with a number of phases all descending into a cascading fashion from a singular event that he describes as the Great Separation. Now, if you listen to stories that MGTOW men have put out, you will always be able to spot such an event. The journey upwards for these men will usually have personalized twists and turns, but it originated with some realization, usually a terrible experience. Some sort of betrayal. A betrayal severe enough to shake up their worldview enough as to demand a reevaluation of what they held sacred before. Now, this event could be a bad breakup or divorce, being dragged through the court system, or some abusive woman in their past. Its particularity does not really matter, though. It was merely the catalyst for that particular man to begin questioning his values. The typical accusation laid at the feet of MGTOW is that they have somehow become damaged, that someone hurt them, and that they have become bitter as a consequence. Now, this accusation has a built-in prejudice against critical thinking. You see, if a man has a bad experience, he will not be labeled damaged only if that experience in no way cracks his conviction in the orthodoxy of male-female relations. In fact, that is the measure by which blue pillars detect a damaged man. I argue, however, that a damaged man can only emerge if, having experienced some grand betrayal, he was not shaken to reevaluate his values. Such a man would not have anything to seek an explanation other than some grand personal failure, and as such could only target himself with his anger. What is worse is that there's nothing he could do to prevent such an incident from occurring again, as that failure is part of his very identity. He would come to think of himself as someone who had it coming. Alternatively, if he placed the blame squarely on the other person, such as a woman, or all people, he too would have no tools to prevent such an occurrence from happening again, as the failure was external and outside his control. Such a man would grow distrustful of the world, because that's just how the world is. But a man for whom such a betrayal merely served as a catalyst, one particular incident that itself has little meaning outside the scope of the underlying value system that allowed for it to occur, that man is not damaged. That man is trying to learn from the lesson contained within that incident, but as of yet has no idea what the content of that lesson is. All he senses is that something is fundamentally wrong, but he has no idea as to yet of what it can be. The betrayal was not that of a person. It was a betrayal of an ideal, and he held true of the world. And as Nietzsche points out, a betrayal of all that is time-honored and dignified. And it occurs suddenly, like the shock of an earthquake. All at once, the young soul is devastated, torn loose, torn out. It itself does not know what is happening, but also jubilation that it was done. Only when the initial shock of the experience begins to wear off does the mind even begin to start making sense of it. By this time, however, the great separation has already occurred, and now it is a matter of how you handle it. It is also a disease that can destroy man, and that is meant to be seen as the terrible realization that the rug has been pulled from under you. You no longer know which beliefs are safe to anchor yourself to. You are free of them all, and with them your identity is lost as well. It is from this vantage point, from that moment of realization, that you truly know nothing about the world, are your shackles broken, and you can begin the journey upward into the light. I can safely imagine that this experience has probably taken the life of more than one man, but those who survive the genesis can no longer unquestionably go back to who they were. In the early stages, one experiences an excess of vivid healing, an excess that gives the free spirit the dangerous privilege of being permitted to live experimentally. With no fetters left, you must relearn how to live, where between here and there may lie years of convalescence, years full of multicolored, painful, magical transformations, a feeling of bird-like freedom. Indeed, now the free spirit concerns himself only with things which no longer trouble him. This is the stage where one is still rejoicing in having the burdens of old cultural expectations lifted. When a man is no longer troubled by notions of getting a girlfriend, concerned with that, well, what women think of him. He exists to indulge himself completely unshackled. In the middle phase, the free spirit again approaches life, slowly, of course, almost recalcitrantly, almost suspiciously. It grows warmer around him again, yellower, as it were. Only now does he see himself, and what surprises does he find there? What untried terrors! It is in this phase that a red pill man begins to think about what their purpose in life is going to be. He is now in a battle against nihilism. All the old ways of finding purpose have been closed off. Well, or have they? He thinks to himself, if there is still something there that in some way can be salvaged. His eyes have not yet fully adjusted. He will explore all sorts of variations on the old themes, trying to make them fit with all he has learned since the great separation. What about fuck buddies or casual dating? Surely those are still permissible. He thinks to himself, why so apart, so alone, renouncing everything I admired, even admiration? Why this severity, this suspicion, this hatred of one's own virtues? In the last stages, he begins to find some answers. You had to become your own master, and also the master of your virtues. Previously, your virtues were your masters, but they must be nothing more than your tools. And finally, he transforms the nature of the inquiry, no longer bound to piece together a symbiotic account of his old values with his new state of being. Here is a new problem. Here is a long ladder on whose rungs we ourselves have sat and climbed, and which we ourselves were at one time. Here is a higher, a deeper, a below us, an enormous long ordering, a hierarchy which we see. Here is our problem. And with this final realization, the red pill man is no longer concerned with fitting in. His own way does not contain a notion like fitting in, or expectations, or obligations, or duty. He becomes a lawgiver of values, and the values he sets become his own way. Thanks for listening. Go team.